The moment a powerful man forgets who helped him climb, success becomes the beginning of his fall. The rain tapped softly against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Grand Meridian, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants. Crystal chandeliers cast warm reflections across polished marble floors. Expensive watches glimmered beneath tailored suit sleeves. Quiet conversations drifted through the room like background music. Everything felt controlled, predictable, refined, until Ethan Blackwood raised his voice. The sharp sound cut through the dining room so suddenly that forks paused halfway to plates and conversations faded into silence. Ethan stood beside a private corner table, his 6'2" frame commanding attention without effort. At 47, he was the face of American success, founder of Blackwood Capital, Billionaire. Business magazines called him a visionary. Financial networks called him a genius. Employees called him demanding. Tonight, nobody seemed interested in those titles. They were all staring at the young waitress standing across from him. Charlotte Hayes remained perfectly still. She held a silver coffee pot in one hand. Her posture never changed. Her expression never cracked. She looked almost unaffected by the billionaire's anger. "This is the third mistake tonight," Ethan said sharply. His voice carried farther than he intended. "Do people just stop caring about standards now?" A nervous manager appeared from across the room, but hesitated before stepping closer. Nobody wanted to interrupt Ethan Blackwood when he was upset. Charlotte glanced briefly at the check folder resting on the table, then at the untouched coffee cup beside it. Her voice remained calm. "Sir, I believe there may be a misunderstanding." Ethan laughed once. It wasn't a pleasant sound. A misunderstanding? He lifted the folder from the table. The wrong receipt was brought to a private client dinner involving a 7-figure acquisition. That's not a misunderstanding. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable looks. Some recognized Ethan immediately. Others only recognized the familiar imbalance of power. Wealth on one side, service uniform on the other. The outcome usually wrote itself. Charlotte simply listened. Rain continued sliding down the glass behind her. Somewhere in the restaurant, a piano player quietly stopped playing. Ethan noticed neither. "Do you even know who I am?" he asked. The question hung in the air. The room seemed to hold its breath. Charlotte lowered the coffee pot onto a nearby service tray. Her movements were unhurried, precise, almost graceful. Then she looked directly into Ethan's eyes. Not with fear, not with defiance, with something far more unsettling. Disappointment. "Yes, Mr. Blackwood," she said softly. "That's exactly why I'm disappointed." Silence. Complete silence. It spread through the dining room like a sudden winter frost. A waiter froze beside the wine station. A couple near the windows stopped speaking altogether. Even the manager standing 20 feet away forgot to move. Ethan stared at her. For a second, he seemed unsure whether he had heard correctly. Nobody spoke to him that way. Not investors. Not executives. Certainly not a waitress. Yet Charlotte's voice contained no insult. No challenge. No hostility. Just a quiet sadness that somehow felt heavier than anger. Ethan felt an unfamiliar sensation twist in his chest. Irritation mixed with confusion. "Excuse me?" he asked. Charlotte held his gaze. "You heard me, sir." The words were respectful, but they landed harder than any accusation. Ethan's jaw tightened. Around him, the restaurant remained trapped in silence. Waiting. Watching. Charlotte should have apologized. She should have stepped back. She should have allowed the moment to end. Instead, she simply stood there beside the rain-streaked windows, calm as ever. The old silver watch on her wrist caught the chandelier light for a brief second. Ethan's eyes flickered toward it without understanding why. Something about it felt strangely familiar. But before he could place the thought, Charlotte reached for the untouched coffee cup. "Would you still like the refill, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked gently. Her voice was steady, professional, as though the world had not just shifted beneath everyone's feet. Ethan didn't answer immediately. For the first time in years, a room full of people watched him without admiration, without fear, without expectation. And somewhere beneath the sound of rain against the glass, a question he had not asked himself in a very long time began quietly forming in his mind. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The question hanging in Ethan Blackwood's mind remained unanswered as Charlotte calmly lifted the coffee pot and filled the cup he had ignored all evening. The rich aroma drifted upward between them. Neither spoke. Around the restaurant, conversations slowly returned, but they came back quieter than before. People glanced toward the corner table, pretending not to look while looking anyway. Charlotte knew that feeling well. She had spent most of her life being observed without being seen. She carried the fresh pot back toward the service station and disappeared behind a polished oak partition near the kitchen. The moment she was out of sight, the tension left her shoulders. Only slightly. Years of practice kept the rest hidden. Sarah, another server, hurried toward her. "Charlotte, are you out of your mind?" she whispered. "Do you know who that is?" Charlotte placed the pot on the counter and offered a small smile. "Yes." "Then why would you say that?" Sarah asked. Charlotte glanced toward the dining room. Through the opening, she could still see Ethan standing beside his table. He looked unsettled, confused, almost human. "Because it was true," she said quietly. Sarah stared at her for a moment before shaking her head and walking away. Charlotte did not blame her. Most people believed success created distance between certain lives. Billionaires belonged in magazines. Waitresses belonged in the background. Few ever questioned the invisible line separating the two worlds. Charlotte understood better than most how thin that line could be. 29 years old. Blonde hair usually tied back before every shift. Blue eyes that noticed details other people missed. Customers remembered her because she was polite. Managers valued her because she never caused problems. Nobody knew she arrived every morning at 5:30. Nobody knew she spent her mornings helping her younger brother, Noah, prepare for physical therapy appointments across the city. Nobody knew that nearly every dollar she saved disappeared into medical expenses, rent, and insurance paperwork. She preferred it that way. Sympathy had never paid a bill. Across the room, Ethan finally sat down. The untouched coffee no longer interested him. His attention kept drifting toward the service station. Something about Charlotte felt familiar. Not her face, not her voice. Something else. Something he could not reach. The feeling irritated him. Ethan built an empire by understanding patterns. He remembered numbers from meetings 10 years earlier. He remembered acquisition details others forgot within days. Yet tonight, one waitress had triggered a memory that refused to fully appear. Charlotte checked another table, delivered 2 desserts, and smiled at a retired couple celebrating an anniversary. To them, she was simply their server. She liked that. Simplicity carried a kind of freedom. No expectations. No headlines. No pressure to become a symbol. Near the end of the dining room stood a large grandfather clock that had not worked in years. Most guests never noticed it. Charlotte always did. Every shift. Every night. Frozen hands pointing to the same forgotten minute. She often wondered whether people became like that too. Trapped inside a version of themselves they no longer recognized. Her fingers brushed the old silver watch resting on her wrist. The watch had stopped years ago. She never repaired it. Some things were more valuable as reminders than as tools. The metal felt cool against her skin. For a brief second, she remembered a younger version of herself sitting inside a crowded office conference room 15 years earlier. A room filled with ambition, pressure, possibility, and one determined young entrepreneur named Ethan Blackwood. The memory appeared and vanished just as quickly. Charlotte returned to the present. A manager approached her. "Mr. Blackwood wants another coffee," he said carefully. Charlotte looked toward the billionaire. Their eyes met across the crowded restaurant. Ethan did not look angry anymore. If anything, he looked curious. That worried her far more. She picked up the coffee pot and began walking back toward his table, unaware that before the night was over, a secret buried for 15 years would force both of them to confront a promise neither had forgotten as completely as they believed. Charlotte stopped beside Ethan's table and carefully poured fresh coffee into the white porcelain cup. Steam rose between them, carrying the rich scent of roasted beans into the quiet air. Ethan watched her hands. Steady, controlled. Not the hands of someone intimidated by a billionaire. Not the hands of someone who regretted what she had said. That bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Most people reacted when confronted. They apologized, defended themselves, explained. Charlotte had done none of those things. She had simply spoken the truth as she saw it and moved on. Ethan glanced at the silver watch resting on her wrist again. The watch looked old, outdated, its face slightly worn from years of use. Yet she wore it with the same care someone might reserve for a priceless family heirloom. "Have we met before?" Ethan finally asked. Charlotte looked up. For a brief moment, something flickered behind her blue eyes. Not surprise. Recognition. Then it disappeared. I serve a lot of customers, Mr. Blackwood, she said politely. That was not my question. Charlotte placed the coffee pot on the service tray. No, it was not. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Across the room, rain continued sliding down the enormous windows overlooking Park Avenue. Headlights reflected across the wet streets below. Manhattan moved forward as it always did. Fast, relentless, unforgiving. Ethan had built his entire life in that rhythm. He had grown up far from luxury, far from private jets and penthouses. 20 years earlier, he had been just another ambitious young entrepreneur working from a cramped office with secondhand furniture and more debt than investors. Back then, every dollar mattered. Every decision mattered. Failure waited around every corner. Somewhere along the way, success had changed the scenery. The risks became larger. The buildings became taller. The bank accounts became impossible to imagine. Yet tonight, sitting inside one of the finest restaurants in New York City, he found himself thinking about those early years more than he had in a decade. Charlotte turned to leave. Wait. She stopped. Ethan rarely used that tone. Softer, less commanding. You said you were disappointed in me. Charlotte remained facing away from him for several seconds before turning back. Yes. Why? The question surprised even him. He was not accustomed to asking strangers for explanations. Charlotte studied him carefully, as though deciding whether he truly wanted the answer. Because once upon a time, you noticed people. Ethan frowned. What does that mean? Charlotte offered a faint smile. Sad. Almost nostalgic. Good night, Mr. Blackwood. Then she walked away. Ethan watched her disappear through the dining room. His pulse quickened with frustration. Not anger. Something else. Curiosity. The dangerous kind. The kind that refused to leave. Across the room, Charlotte entered the employee corridor leading toward the kitchen. The noise of the restaurant faded behind her. She paused beside a storage door and closed her eyes briefly. 15 years. 15 years of silence. 15 years since she had promised herself she would never reopen that chapter of her life. Yet tonight fate seemed determined to ignore her plans. Her fingers touched the silver watch again. The memory returned immediately. A crowded conference room. Financial reports spread across a table. A young Ethan Blackwood standing before nervous investors, fighting to keep his struggling company alive. And a 19-year-old Charlotte Hayes noticing a mistake nobody else had seen. One conversation had changed everything. One decision had altered the course of a future worth billions. Charlotte opened her eyes. Footsteps approached behind her. Charlotte, the manager called. There is a gentleman here asking for you. Her stomach tightened. Who? The manager hesitated. A private investigator. Charlotte froze. And in the dining room, Ethan Blackwood had already made the decision that would begin uncovering a secret buried for 15 years. Charlotte stared at the manager for a moment, certain she had misheard him. A private investigator. Here. Tonight. The words settled heavily in her chest. For 15 years, she had carefully built a life designed to attract no attention. She paid her bills, worked her shifts, helped her brother, stayed invisible. Invisible people did not receive visits from investigators. The manager shifted uneasily. He says he only wants 5 minutes. Charlotte glanced toward the dining room. Through the narrow doorway, she could still see Ethan Blackwood seated at his table. His coffee sat untouched again. His attention appeared fixed on the rain beyond the glass. But something told her he was thinking about her. That realization made the situation worse. Where is he? She asked quietly. Lobby. Charlotte nodded once and began walking. Each step felt heavier than the last. The Grand Meridian's lobby was nearly empty at this hour. A few guests crossed polished marble floors while doormen watched the rain outside. Near a row of leather chairs stood a man in a dark gray suit holding a thin folder. He appeared to be in his early 50s. Professional, polite, careful, the kind of person trained to notice details. The kind of person Charlotte had spent years avoiding. The man stood as she approached. Charlotte Hayes. She stopped several feet away. Who was asking? The man offered a business card. Daniel Mercer. Independent investigator. Charlotte accepted the card but did not look at it. What do you want? Mercer studied her expression. Not hostile. Not frightened. Simply tired. I was hired to locate someone connected to Blackwood Capital's early operations. Charlotte felt her pulse slow instead of quicken. Sometimes the worst fears arrived so often in imagination that reality felt strangely familiar when they finally appeared. And Mercer opened the folder. Inside rested several photocopied documents. Old financial reports, meeting attendance sheets, notes from board discussions long forgotten by nearly everyone involved. Nearly everyone. Charlotte recognized them immediately. Her stomach tightened. I believe that person may be you. The lobby seemed quieter than before. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows. Somewhere near the entrance, a bell chimed as new. Guests arrived from the storm. Mercer continued carefully. 15 years ago, Blackwood Capital nearly collapsed during a financing round. Several records reference an unnamed intern who identified a forecasting error that would have cost the company millions. Charlotte remained silent. Nobody remembers her name, Mercer said. Until recently, Charlotte finally looked at the documents. One sheet contained handwritten notes. Her notes. The sight sent a wave of memories rushing back. Endless nights. Cheap coffee. Stacks of reports. Dreams bigger than reality. And a young entrepreneur who refused to quit. Why is Ethan looking for this person now? She asked. Mercer hesitated. Actually, he is not. Charlotte frowned. What? Mr. Blackwood asked me to learn more about you after tonight. The answer surprised her. Only me. Mercer nodded. I found the connection by accident. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Charlotte laughed softly. Not because anything was funny. Because fate occasionally displayed a strange sense of timing. Across Manhattan, thousands of stories unfolded every hour. Yet somehow this one had found its way back. Mercer closed the folder. May I ask you a question? Charlotte folded her arms. You just did. A small smile crossed his face. Why did you disappear? The question lingered between them. Charlotte looked toward the rain-covered streets outside. Headlights blurred across wet pavement. The city moved forward. Always forward. Because life happened, she answered quietly. And because some promises matter more than ambition. Mercer seemed ready to ask another question when a familiar voice interrupted from behind them. I have been trying to remember where I know you from. Charlotte slowly turned. Ethan Blackwood stood several feet away. The confusion in his eyes had vanished. In its place was recognition. Partial. Incomplete. But growing. And for the first time that evening, Charlotte realized the past was no longer content to remain buried. Charlotte felt the air leave her lungs. Ethan stood motionless near the lobby entrance, his dark overcoat still damp from the rain outside. For several seconds nobody spoke. Daniel. Mercer quietly stepped aside, sensing that whatever happened next belonged to them. Ethan studied Charlotte with growing intensity. It was the look of a man assembling scattered pieces of a puzzle he had not realized he was solving. The watch, he said softly. Charlotte glanced down at the silver watch resting on her wrist. What about it? Ethan took another step closer. I have seen that watch before. Charlotte's expression remained calm, but her fingers tightened slightly around the worn leather strap. 15 years suddenly felt like 15 minutes. Ethan rubbed his jaw. The memory remained incomplete. Frustratingly incomplete. Yet it was there. He could feel it. There was a conference room, he said slowly. An old building on Lexington Avenue. We were preparing for an investor presentation. Charlotte said nothing. Ethan continued. Everyone was focused on the revenue projections. Everyone except one intern. Daniel Mercer looked between them. The silence confirmed more than any answer could have. Ethan's eyes widened slightly. It was you. Charlotte lowered her gaze toward the marble floor. The polished surface reflected the chandelier light above them. You finally remembered. Ethan stared at her. The words landed harder than he expected. 15 years earlier, Blackwood Capital had barely survived. Investors were preparing to walk away. Funding was disappearing. Payroll had become a weekly miracle. Then an intern had noticed an error buried inside a forecasting model. A small mistake. One number entered incorrectly. One assumption repeated through dozens of calculations. Left unnoticed, it would have destroyed the company's credibility in front of investors. Ethan remembered the panic, the pressure, the sleepless nights. And then he remembered her. Young, quiet, intelligent, sitting at the end of the conference table with a stack of reports almost as tall as she was. He remembered everyone dismissing her concerns until she calmly proved she was right. The room suddenly felt smaller. You saved us, Ethan said. Charlotte shook her head. No, I corrected a spreadsheet. That spreadsheet saved the company. The company saved itself, she replied. You did the hard part. Ethan laughed softly. Not because anything was funny. Because she sounded exactly the same. 15 years had changed almost everything about his life. Yet Charlotte still spoke with the same quiet certainty she had possessed as a teenager. "Why did you leave?" he asked. Charlotte looked toward the rain beyond the glass doors. "Because life changed." Ethan waited. She offered nothing more. The old frustration returned. Not anger. Curiosity. Again. Always curiosity. "That is not an answer." Charlotte smiled faintly. "Sometimes it is." Ethan opened his mouth to continue when his phone vibrated. A message from his chief operating officer appeared on the screen. Normally, he would have answered immediately. Tonight he ignored it. For perhaps the first time in years, business no longer felt like the most important thing in front of him. Charlotte noticed the gesture. The younger Ethan would have done the same. The older Ethan rarely did. "You know," Ethan said quietly, "I spent years wondering how things might have turned out if that mistake had not been caught." Charlotte met his eyes. "And I spent years hoping success would not change you." The words settled heavily between them. Ethan looked away first. Not because he was offended, because he knew there was truth in them. More truth than he wanted to admit. Across the lobby, the grandfather clock struck another hour. The sound echoed softly through the marble hall. Charlotte checked the time instinctively before remembering her watch no longer worked. Ethan noticed. "Why do you still wear it?" he asked. Charlotte hesitated. Then she answered, "Because it reminds me of a promise." Ethan frowned. "What promise?" For the first time all evening, genuine emotion crossed her face. Not sadness, not regret, something deeper. "The promise you made the day everything changed." Ethan's heartbeat quickened. He remembered making many promises back then. Most had been forgotten beneath years of meetings, acquisitions, and headlines. But suddenly he was no longer sure which promise she meant. And deep inside, he feared the answer. The question lingered between them long after the grandfather clock fell. Silent, Charlotte looked down at the old silver watch resting against her wrist. The worn metal reflected a faint glow from the chandelier above. Ethan followed her gaze. Somewhere deep inside his memory, another piece shifted into place. Not enough to reveal the whole picture, just enough to make him uneasy. "What promise?" he asked again. Charlotte remained quiet for several seconds. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost lost beneath the sound of rain tapping against the glass. "The day the investors agreed to stay." Ethan felt a chill move through him. He remembered that day. Every detail. The relief. The exhaustion. The impossible feeling that his dream might actually survive. The conference room had erupted with celebration after months of uncertainty. People had shaken hands, laughed, made plans. He had been 29 years old and convinced he could change the world. "I remember," he said slowly. Charlotte nodded. "Then you remember what you said before everyone left." Ethan searched his memory. Fragments appeared. Faces. Conversations. Empty coffee cups scattered across a table. But the exact words remained hidden. Charlotte smiled faintly. "You stood beside the window and thanked everyone who helped save the company." Ethan listened. "Then you said something I never forgot." The lobby seemed to grow quieter around them. Even Daniel Mercer remained completely still. Charlotte looked directly at Ethan. "You said that if success ever made you forget how ordinary people carried extraordinary value, then you would have failed no matter how much money you earned." Ethan stared at her. The words struck with startling force. Because he remembered them. Not perfectly. Not every syllable. But enough. He had said something very close to that. Back when he still measured success differently. Back when every employee mattered because there were so few of them. Back when gratitude came naturally. The realization settled heavily inside him. Charlotte continued. "You gave me that watch before I left." Ethan glanced at the silver watch again. Another memory surfaced. A small gift purchased from a department store. Nothing expensive. Nothing remarkable. Just a gesture of appreciation from a struggling entrepreneur to a young intern who had helped save his company. "You kept it all these years?" he asked quietly. Charlotte nodded. "The battery died a long time ago." Ethan almost smiled. "Then why not replace it?" Charlotte's expression softened. "Because I never wore it to tell time." The answer landed deeper than she intended. Ethan looked away. Through the rain-covered windows, Manhattan glowed beneath thousands of lights. A city built on ambition. A city that rewarded success and rarely asked what it cost. For the first time in years, Ethan found himself wondering about that cost. Not financial cost. Personal cost. Somewhere between the small office on Lexington Avenue and the private jets, boardrooms, and magazine covers. He had become someone capable of humiliating a waitress in public without learning her story first. Charlotte had seen it happen. And worse, she had remembered the man he used to be. "I owe you an apology," Ethan said quietly. Charlotte immediately shook her head. "No." Ethan frowned. "No, you do not owe me an apology because of the past." Her eyes met his. Calm, honest, uncomfortable. "You owe yourself an apology because you stopped being the person who made that promise." The words left him speechless. Nobody in his world spoke to him this way. Advisors protected him. Executives agreed with him. Reporters admired him. Investors depended on him. Yet this waitress standing in a hotel lobby seemed more interested in telling him the truth than impressing him. And that truth hurt. Not because it was cruel, because it was accurate. Ethan lowered his gaze. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Charlotte's phone vibrated inside her apron pocket. She checked the screen. Her expression changed immediately. Concern replaced calm. Ethan noticed. "Is everything all right?" Charlotte read the message again. Her younger brother's physical therapist had sent it. Noah had collapsed during an evening session. The therapist assured her he was stable, but they were taking him to the hospital for observation. Charlotte's face paled slightly. Ethan saw it. And without realizing it, the next decision he made would begin changing both of their lives. Charlotte read the message a second time. Then a third. The words did not change. Noah had collapsed during therapy. Stable. Under observation. Further updates to follow. Most people would have seen reassurance in those words. Charlotte saw uncertainty. Years of hospital visits had taught her that uncertainty carried its own weight. She slipped the phone back into her apron pocket and immediately started toward the exit. Ethan stepped forward. "Charlotte." She stopped. "I need to go." "To the hospital?" She looked at him, surprised. Ethan nodded toward the phone. "I guessed." Daniel Mercer quietly excused himself and walked away, leaving them alone in the lobby. Rain continued tapping against the glass doors. Charlotte glanced outside. The storm had grown heavier. Traffic crawled through Manhattan like a river of red brake lights. Every minute would matter. Ethan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his car keys. "I will take you." Charlotte immediately shook her head. "That is not necessary. Neither was correcting my company 15 years ago. That was different." "Was it?" Charlotte opened her mouth to argue, then stopped. She did not have time. Ethan could see the conflict in her eyes. Pride on one side, concern for Noah on the other. "Please," he said quietly. The word surprised both of them. Ethan Blackwood rarely asked. Charlotte studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded once. 20 minutes later, they were moving through rainy Manhattan streets in the back of a black sedan. The city lights reflected across wet pavement. Neither spoke much. Charlotte stared out the window while Ethan watched the skyline pass by. The silence between them felt different now. Less hostile, less defensive, more honest. Finally, Ethan spoke. "How old is Noah?" Charlotte kept her eyes on the ring. 23. "Your younger brother?" She nodded. "What happened?" Charlotte hesitated. Most people asked questions because they were curious. Ethan sounded as though he genuinely wanted to understand. "A neurological condition," she said quietly. "He was diagnosed when he was 12. Ethan listened. "And you have been taking care of him ever since?" Charlotte smiled faintly. "Not alone. He takes care of me too." Ethan found himself smiling for the first time that evening. The answer felt exactly like something she would say. Outside, a siren echoed somewhere in the distance. The city continued moving through the storm. Charlotte looked down at her hands. "When our parents died, there was nobody else." Ethan turned toward her. "I did not know. You were not supposed to." The answer carried no accusation, only fact. "I left college." She paused. "I left a lot of things." Ethan understood what she meant. Ambition, opportunity, dreams. Sometimes life demanded a different price than money. "And the restaurant?" he asked. "Flexible hours. Health insurance. Stable income." She shrugged lightly. "Not glamorous, but useful." Ethan stared out the opposite window. He thought about private planes, corporate retreats, luxury penthouses, things he barely noticed anymore. Then he thought about a young woman giving up an entire future so her brother would not face his alone. Suddenly, the definition of success felt far less clear than it had that morning. The sedan pulled beneath the covered entrance of St. Vincent Medical Center. Charlotte reached for the door handle. Ethan spoke before she could leave. "Charlotte." She turned. "I am sorry." The words were simple, No speech. No explanation. No defense. Just truth. Charlotte looked at him carefully. Rain drummed against the roof above them. For a moment she saw not the billionaire. Not the headlines. Not the man from the restaurant. She saw the young entrepreneur from 15 years ago. The one who still believed character mattered more than status. "I know," she said softly. Then she stepped out into the storm. Ethan watched her hurry toward the hospital entrance. And as the doors closed behind her, he realized something that unsettled him more than any business crisis ever had. For 15 years he had believed he built his company alone. Tonight he was beginning to understand how many invisible people had helped carry him there. The hospital waiting area smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. Soft lighting reflected across polished floors, while nurses moved quietly through the halls. Charlotte sat alone beneath a large window overlooking the rain-soaked city. Her hands rested in her lap, calm on the outside, exhausted underneath. She had spent years mastering that balance. Worry changed nothing. Patience changed everything. A doctor finally emerged from the hallway. Charlotte immediately stood. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes, but the relief arrived instantly. Noah was stable. The collapse had been caused by exhaustion and dehydration during therapy. Precautions would be taken. Additional tests would follow. Nothing life-threatening had been discovered. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. For the first time all night, she could breathe normally. When she opened them again, she noticed Ethan sitting quietly across the waiting area. He had not left. The realization surprised her. Most people would have offered sympathy and gone home. Ethan remained seated with a paper coffee cup in his hand, still wearing the same suit from dinner. The billionaire who could have been anywhere in the world was sitting in a hospital at nearly midnight. Waiting. Charlotte walked toward him. "You stayed." Ethan looked up from his coffee. "You looked like someone who should not be alone." Charlotte sat beside him. Neither spoke for a while. Rain continued sliding down the enormous windows overlooking Manhattan. The city lights blurred into soft streaks of gold and white. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "I spent the drive here thinking about something." Charlotte glanced at him. "That sounds dangerous." A faint smile appeared on his face. "Probably." The smile disappeared almost as quickly. "I have spent years believing success was about growth. Revenue. Market share. Acquisitions." Charlotte listened quietly. "Tonight, I realized I stopped measuring the things that mattered first." Charlotte looked toward the ring. "Most people do." Ethan nodded slowly. "That does not make it acceptable." The honesty in his voice felt unfamiliar. Not because he was lying, because he was not. Nearby, an elderly couple sat together in silence. A nurse offered them directions. Somewhere down the hallway, a child laughed. The ordinary sounds of ordinary people. Ethan noticed them all, for perhaps the first time in years. "When my company succeeded," he said quietly, "I promised myself I would never become the kind of person who only valued people based on status." Charlotte turned toward him. "And yet," Ethan stared into his coffee. "And yet tonight I stood in a restaurant and treated the woman who helped save my company like she did not matter." The words hung between them. No excuses. No justification. Just truth. Charlotte studied him carefully. Most apologies focused on reputation. This one focused on character. There was a difference. A significant one. "People change," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "I know. The important question is whether they notice." He looked at her. "And if they do?" Charlotte glanced at the old silver watch resting on her wrist. "Then they get a chance to decide who they want to become next." Ethan followed her gaze. For years that watch had represented a forgotten promise. Tonight it represented something else. A second chance. The thought settled deeply inside him. Early the next morning, after Noah was discharged with instructions to rest, Charlotte returned briefly to the Grand Meridian to collect her belongings. News of the previous evening had already spread through the staff. Curious looks followed her through the restaurant. She ignored them. What surprised her was what she found waiting near the center of the dining room. Every employee had been called together before opening. Managers, servers, hosts, kitchen staff. Nearly 40 people stood quietly as Ethan Blackwood addressed them. Charlotte stopped near the entrance. He had not noticed her yet. Ethan stood without notes, without assistants, without public relations advisors. Just a man speaking plainly. "Yesterday," he said, "I made a mistake." The room fell silent. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Ethan continued. "I judged someone without knowing her story. Worse, I forgot a lesson I once believed strongly. Charlotte felt her heartbeat quicken. Ethan looked around the room. At every employee, every uniform, every face. No position determines a person's value. And no title excuses a lack of respect. Silence followed. Heavy, honest, real. Then Ethan's eyes found Charlotte, standing near the doorway. For a moment, neither spoke. 15 years earlier, a young entrepreneur had made a promise. Today, in a quiet restaurant before opening hours, he finally began keeping it. Charlotte stood near the doorway as silence settled across the restaurant. No one seemed to know what to say after Ethan's words. The employees exchanged glances. Some looked surprised. Others looked skeptical. A few simply looked relieved. In a city filled with powerful people, public apologies were rare. Genuine ones were even rarer. Ethan slowly stepped away from the center of the room. He was no longer speaking as a billionaire. He was speaking as a man who had finally recognized a flaw he could not solve with money. Charlotte walked toward him. The old silver watch rested against her wrist. The same watch that had traveled through 15 years of ordinary mornings, hospital visits, double shifts, and quiet sacrifices. Ethan noticed it immediately. This time, however, he did not see a reminder of the past. He saw a reminder of the future. "Noah is doing better?" he asked. Charlotte nodded. "He is already annoyed that everyone keeps telling him to rest." Ethan smiled. "That sounds healthy." "It is." For a moment, they simply stood there while the restaurant prepared to open. Coffee machines hummed. Silverware clinked softly. Sunlight pushed through the windows where rain had fallen only hours before. Everything felt strangely normal, and somehow that made the moment more meaningful. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small envelope. "This is for you." Charlotte looked at it, but did not take it. "What is it?" "An offer." Charlotte sighed quietly. "Ethan." He raised a hand. "Just read it." Reluctantly, she accepted the envelope and opened it. Inside was a formal employment proposal. Senior Strategy Advisor. Blackwood Capital. A salary that would have changed her life overnight. Charlotte read the page once. Then again. Finally, she folded it and returned it to him. Ethan blinked. "You did not even think about it." "I did. For 10 seconds. That was enough." Ethan stared at her. "Most people would accept immediately." Charlotte smiled gently. "Most people are not me." He could not argue with that. "Why?" he asked. Charlotte glanced around the restaurant. At the servers preparing tables. At the cooks arriving through the kitchen doors. At the hostess organizing reservations. Ordinary people beginning another ordinary day. Because success is not the same thing as purpose. Ethan listened carefully. "For years I thought I gave up my future," Charlotte continued. "Then one day I realized I had simply chosen a different one." She looked toward the window where sunlight reflected across the city. "No one needs me. My life needs me. And honestly," a small smile appeared, "I like who I became." Ethan lowered his eyes. There was no disappointment in her refusal. No bitterness. No regret. Only peace. And somehow that felt more valuable than any business victory he had ever achieved. Several weeks later, life returned to its familiar rhythm. Charlotte continued working at the Grand Meridian. Noah returned to therapy. The city kept moving. But not everything remained the same. One afternoon, a framed photograph appeared near the employee entrance. It showed the entire restaurant staff gathered together. Beneath it was a small bronze plaque. The inscription read, "Respect is the foundation of every great institution." No name was attached. None was needed. Months later, during an interview on national television, a reporter asked Ethan Blackwood what the most important lesson of his career had been. Millions expected him to mention investments, leadership, or innovation. Instead, he paused. Then he answered quietly, "The people who change your life are not always the ones standing on a stage. Sometimes they are standing beside you while you are too distracted to notice." Across Manhattan, Charlotte happened to hear the interview while pouring coffee for a customer. She smiled but said nothing. Then she returned to work. The old watch remained on her wrist. The city remained busy. The restaurant remained full. Yet somewhere between a forgotten promise and a second chance, two lives had quietly changed forever. And perhaps that was the lesson after all. The strongest people are not the ones who demand respect. They are the ones who offer it first. She never raised her voice. She simply reminded everyone what true success was supposed to sound like.